Good afternoon, everybody. Really nice to see you guys all again. Because this paper is going to be out for public, I just want to record this video with all you. And yeah, as well said, feel free to have questions for me. I'm happy to answer. Yeah, the title of the paper and the topic of this talk is going to be high entropy oxide, cobalt, copper, magnesium, nickel, zinc oxide, which exhibits grain size dependent deformation, especially at room temperature. And this work was done when I was a postdoc in Will's lab, and it's in collaboration with students, postdoc in Professor Julie Shonon's group as well. So maybe you guys are familiar, the concept of high entropy materials is really a rush in the past few years, decades, and it has vastly expanded the compositional space for the discovery of new materials for our future. In the year of 2015, this high entropy materials design strategy was first applied to ceramic materials for high entropy oxide. As is shown in this schematic here, the high entropy oxide with near equimolar cations of cobalt, copper, magnesium, nickel, and zinc were formed. And despite this very complex composition in this material, a very simple single phase rock solid solution structure as shown here has been retained and can be retained down to nanoscale after we do appropriate processing. Besides the theoretical importance of this material, the new class of materials also offers entropy-enhanced stability and compositionally tunable properties, which are highly desirable for the next generation of either functional or structural applications. Due to all these benefits, so over the past few years, the promise of high entropy oxide as either thermal insulators, cathodes, or anodes for lithium-ion batteries, also wear-resistant coatings, this water-splitting materials, as well as a lot of catalyst carriers has been extensively explored. Further development of HEOs, however, for a bunch of these engineering applications listed here require the material have sufficient mechanical properties. So in order to better understand their mechanical behavior, we performed this study. So in the literature, if you read some papers about the high entropy oxide, the mechanical behavior of HEOs has received far less attention compared to their functional properties. Among those few studies, Hong et al., they examined the bending strengths of HEOs and reported a trade-off between the grain size and the mechanical behavior, as shown here in this table. And also through some indentation experiments, as well as modeling, Pitike and colleagues established that high entropy oxides exhibits isotropic elastic behavior, and further their modeling calculations predicted that this material has the potential for some meaningful plastic deformation. However, their studies didn't show the actual deformation mechanisms of this high entropy oxide, and this is still largely unknown in the literature. As we studied in a lot of the textbooks, we know that ceramics, they rarely exhibit microscopic ductility at ambient temperatures. But for example, magnesia, MgO, with a rock salt structure is probably one of the few exceptions. MgO, they can exhibit bulk plasticity down to room temperature or even lower. And the dislocations in MgO can be generated by just plastic deformation, and the energetics and morphologies of the dislocations, as you can see by this micrographs, TM micrographs, they're highly dependent on the deformation temperature. So by seeing all these preliminary results on high entropy oxide and other conventional oxides, we hypothesize that similar to the rock salt MgO, the novel high entropy oxide can exhibit noticeable room temperature plasticity and some grain size dependent mechanical behavior at room temperature. So our objectives are listed here. We want to investigate the deformation mechanisms of this rock salt HEO at ambient temperature, and also understand how grain size of this HEO affect the operating mechanisms. So this slide describes our methodologies. HEOs with micron and nano-grains were fabricated using spark plasma sintering, and the average grain sizes are measured to be 1.4 micron and 75 nanometers respectively for the micron and nano-grain sized sample. Then nano-scratch testing was performed on the polished sample surface. A typical nano-scratch test involves penetrating a sample surface using a conical diamond nano indenter, followed by moving the indenter across the sample surface with a linearly increased downward penetration force from on the left 0 and to the right is about 200 micronewton, as described in this schematic. It results in a controlled region of penetration, which is called the scratch groove, and surrounding it a very localized area of failure and plastic deformation zone. By comparing the depth profile of the two HEO samples with different grain sizes at selected low and high load regions, we can notice that the micron-grain HEO shows a shallower penetration depths, and therefore the hardness of it is actually seems to be higher than the nano-grain HEO, which is inverse to the well-known Hall patch relationship. And to investigate the deformation structure in these two samples, we performed cross-sectional TEM specimen lift-outs using focused ion beam and at both low and high load regions for the two samples, and the orientation of the TM samples were like this, perpendicular to the scratch direction. So first, we take a look at the micron-grain sized HEO. The cross-sectional STEM images of this deformation microstructure at regions with a normal load of 150 micronewton. The scratch grooves is at the top of this figure A, and we can see that there's a deformation zone, which within this zone, the grains appear deformed or contain some dislocations and other defects in it. And in figure B, it shows when we move further away from the nano scratch groove, the grains appear mostly equiaxed, and they are very clear, free of dislocations. However, in contrast, near the scratch groove in the grains within this plastic deformation zone, we will see the dark field and the bright field TM images show a very high density of dislocations formed near the scratch groove. So this result is surprising, and also it indicates that HEO has potential for very significant dislocation-based ductility, as well as the string hardening. So we used this dark field STEM images to calculate the dislocation density, which is about 3.4 times 10 to the 14 per meter square. So this dislocation density is even comparable to some of the cold rolled metals or alloys. So it's a very high density of dislocations for ceramics. Yeah, so if we take a look at the dislocation structures for HEO, we can notice that the dislocations looks, most of the dislocations look like straight lines. So if we take a look at this dislocation microstructure for magnesia, for example, when we're deformed at room temperature and high temperatures, respectively, we will see that the dislocation morphology for HEOs when deformed at room temperature is very similar to the room temperature, to the dislocations in the room temperature deformed MgO. So there are some similarities between the rock salt HEO and the rock salt MgO, the conventional counterpart. So we've taken a further step to study the dislocation characteristics. For example, their Burgers vector, their slip planes. So in order to do this, we performed a lot of tilting analysis and tilt the samples to different two-beam conditions and using the G.B invisibility criteria and a lot of the tilting analysis of the slip planes, we identified that the dislocation glide in the HEO is similar to that in magnesium oxide, which is the dislocations slip planes are the 110 planes, and the Burgers vectors were half 1-1-0 direction. So this is, yeah, as I said, it's very comparable with the dislocation types usually observed in magnesium oxide, that the dislocation glide is on a relatively less dense 110 planes instead of the 111 planes, which has the highest dislocation density, which has the highest atomic density. So this is very related to the charge for the positive and negative charge in order to remain a neutral charge for these after the dislocation lines pass through the crystals. So we also now analyze the elemental distribution in this HEO at the dislocation slip planes when they have a bunch of dislocations, whether they will generate some chemical inhomogeneity. And we noticed no obvious chemical inhomogeneity induced by these dislocations. So as you can see in this STEM EDS maps, these 5 different cations as well as oxygen, they appear uniformly distributed at this cross-section of 2 slip planes. So yeah. Then we also use some high resolution STEM images in order to see the core structure of those dislocations. We see the dislocations are usually, yeah, as we discussed earlier, they were usually appear as very straight dislocation lines, and they were on the 110, like this this normal, these 2 perpendicular 110 planes are marked by these 2 white lines. The dislocations seems to be parallel to these 110 slip planes. And we also notice there are few edge dislocations, and most of them appear as screw dislocations. And those edge dislocations were usually observed very close to the grain boundaries, as is shown here in this region next to a grain boundary. And there are 2 edge dislocations were being observed, and their Burgers vectors were marked by this Burgers loop. And yeah, most dislocations were screw type dislocations with their Burgers vector a little bit hard to tell from high resolution images. Their morphology was something like this. When you can see the brighter contrast, but if you have this inverse F50 filtered image, you will see the screw type dislocations appear something like this. But again, most dislocations appear as this half 110 screw type dislocations in this HEO. Now we take a look at this nano-grain HEO, the smaller grain-sized sample. We see that for this nano-grain HEO, near the scratch groove, we see a very obvious densified region. So in this densified region, there are less pores at the grain boundaries or triple junctions. In this bright field STEM image, this densified region appears darker, indicating higher density in this region. And we still noticed some dislocations, even the grain size is extremely small. These dislocations were also identified to be the same type, 110 type screw dislocations, similar to the micron-grain sized sample. And at a higher load of about 150 micronewton, we started to see the formation of micro cracks in this sample, in this nano-grain sample, near the scratch groove. And there's a higher magnification image of this crack. You will see they were mostly intergranular. They propagate along the grain boundaries of the nano-grain sample. And we also performed EDS in order to see the chemical distribution. And we noticed some trace amount of secondary phases, copper-rich secondary phases, for example. But we don't think this crack propagation have a very strong correlation with the secondary phases. They seem to be just propagating along some HEO grain boundaries, matrix grain boundaries. So yeah, so in conclusion, in this paper, we have used nano-scratch tests to understand the deformation mechanisms in this cobalt, copper, magnesium, nickel, zinc oxide, high entropy oxides. So unlike most of the ceramics, this HEO exhibits prominent and very complex dislocation activity during the plastic deformation. And the considerable dislocation activity observed in the micron-grain HEO was identified to be predominantly screw type 110, 1-bar-10 dislocations, which indicates that this HEO has a potential for dislocation-based ductility as well as strain hardening. And additionally, we found grain size changes the deformation mechanisms, with the nanocrystalline samples exhibiting more brittle deformation due to the grain boundary mediated sliding or dislocation, as well as dislocation activities in and followed by the intergranular crack formation, as shown in this micrograph. So our work demonstrates that the HEO will possibly have potential for encouraging and some tunable mechanical behavior. And looking into the future, we hypothesize that the complex mechanical behavior may exist in not only this HEO, but other high entropy oxide compositions. And the present results hopefully will give some reason to reevaluate some previously discovered HEOs and established some material design strategies. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge our founding sources from NSF, as well as UCI Emory Materials Research Institute, or Emory, for some facility support. And we also acknowledge the founding from NSF MERSAC, Materials Research Science and Engineering Centers. I would also like to acknowledge everyone from Professor Bowman's group and for their support and a lot of great suggestions that make this work happen. Thank you so much.